The smell of mildewed paper and stale cigar smoke hung heavy in the air of the backroom at Gascoigne's antiquarian auction house. Dr. Alastair Finch, a historian whose career had been built on the marginalia of the forgotten Victorian age, was sifting through a forgotten lot of photographic glass plates. Most were innocuous, sun-bleached family picnics and stern-faced parlor groups, but then he found the image. It was a large, square silver gelatin print, titled simply in the auctioneer's scrawl, "Schoolroom Interior, circa 1880. Alastair held it up to the dusty window light. The scene was instantly recognizable as a one-room schoolhouse, rendered in a rich, melancholic sepia. A severe-looking woman, the mistress, stood proudly to the left, her dark dress a block of unwavering authority. 24 or so children were arranged in their wooden desks, pencils poised above slates. An older man, presumably the schoolmaster, hovered vaguely by the back wall. The light pouring in from the tall, multipaned windows was almost blinding. Alastair, accustomed to the forced rigidity of early portraiture, initially dismissed the stiffness. Yet, the longer he studied the print, the more an icy prickle ran down his arms. It wasn't the pose that was wrong, it was the unnatural stillness. In every other photograph from that era, there was always some telltale sign of a child's impatience, a slight blur of a foot, a tilt of a head, or a tiny shift of the eyes. But these pupils were perfectly, uncannily motionless. Their heads were uniformly bowed, their shoulders set, their hands fixed in the act of writing. Not one pair of eyes met the lens, or even seemed to acknowledge the world outside the plane of their wooden desks. They were less like living beings posing for a picture and more like figures carved from cedarwood. Alastair knew immediately this was no ordinary photograph of childhood discipline. There was a profound, disturbing obedience etched into the scene, a stillness that suggested not reverence for the camera, but something far darker. He felt an obligation, a deep, professional compulsion, to peel back the layers of that unnerving silence. He purchased the lot for a pittance, the dealer clearly believing it held no value beyond the faded paper. He knew the names of the people in this room were lost, but their secret, he vowed, would not be. The long, grim investigation into the history of the Cedarwood schoolhouse was about to begin. Alastair's immediate task was to locate the scene. The map on the schoolhouse wall, though faint, suggested the American Midwest, specifically, the less settled regions of Missouri or Iowa, a geographic anonymity that only deepened the mystery. After cross-referencing archival land deeds with the unusual architectural style, he pinpointed the location, a tiny, isolated community named Oakhaven. The town was barely a dot on modern maps, long since swallowed by agricultural expansion. Oakhaven's written history was sparse, almost aggressively so. Its local records spoke proudly of its religious piety and robust harvest yields, but were eerily silent on civic life between 1875 and 1880. When Alastair finally unearthed a brittle local almanac from 1879, he found an oblique mention of a community crisis referred to only as the Great Quietude. The almanac entry was not a formal record but a devotional sermon, thanking God for lifting the affliction of the quiet ailment which had tested the town's faith. There was talk of widespread lethargy and a sanctioned silence that had descended upon Oakhaven, yet nowhere was there mention of a single death, a burial, or a closure of the school. The text positioned the event as a spiritual trial, not a biological disaster. Alastair felt the cold certainty of a cover-up. The sheer number of children in the photograph, around 24, suggested a calamity too large to simply vanish from the official ledgers. Oakhaven hadn't just forgotten its dead, it had actively chosen to bury the narrative under layers of pious rhetoric and quiet pride. The name of the school, however, was clearly inscribed in the old deed records, the Cedarwood Schoolhouse. Alastair realized that the village's first lesson hadn't been in arithmetic or grammar, but in deception. He had the setting and the name. Now he needed the antagonist, the woman who stood so rigidly by the blackboard. Alastair's research led him to a small, hand-stitched pamphlet bound with fading blue ribbon, tucked away in the Oakhaven Historical Society's miscellany drawer. It was a collection of essays written by the schoolmistress herself, titled, On the Virtue of Stillness and the Eradication of Frivolity. The author was identified as Matilda Albright. Her prose was cold, precise, and intensely unsettling. For Mistress Albright, childhood was not a period of growth, but a time of untamed, dangerous noise that had to be beaten into submission. She saw natural youthful exuberance, the fidgeting, the whispering, the dreams, as sins that polluted the holy act of learning. A crucial section was devoted to her philosophy of the perfect pupil, which she described as a being characterized by absolute, unwavering immobility. She wrote, "The mind's greatest work is done when the body is forgotten. A student who moves is a mind that wanders. Only when the limbs are locked and the gaze fixed can true wisdom enter the vacant vessel." When the quiet ailment began to spread in Oakhaven in the summer of 1878, causing children to become unnaturally still and mechanical, Mistress Albright did not see a medical emergency. She saw a miracle. The diary of the schoolmaster, a man named Bartholomew Finch, no relation to Alastair, hinted at her reaction. Finch's frantic, barely legible entries described her terrifying elation. Matilda smiles. She says God himself has answered her prayers for discipline. She calls their sickness the sanctified silence, and insists they have finally achieved the perfect posture of learning. She forbade any doctor from examining them, declaring they were merely concentrating with a divine focus. Alastair understood now. The picture wasn't a product of an illness, it was the frenzied realization of one woman's twisted creed. She wasn't just posing the dead, she was celebrating her triumph of discipline. Alastair managed to secure digitized copies of the official ledger from the Oakhaven area's sole traveling medical professional, a Dr. Silas Thorne, no relation to the Elias Thorne of past stories, of course. Thorne's entries from the summer and autumn of 1878 painted a harrowing clinical picture that was entirely at odds with Oakhaven's Great Quietude narrative. The disease was indeed a fever, but its final stage was unique and terrifying. Dr. Thorne described the victims, almost exclusively children, entering a state of waking catatonia. They were conscious, their pupils would constrict to light, their breathing remained steady, but they were unable to move or communicate. Thorne called it stasis silentia. Crucially, the doctor noted the strange, residual motor function. The children's hands would often mimic repetitive movements they were engaged in just as the paralysis took hold. Young Master Davies sits frozen, but his right hand taps the rhythm of the multiplication tables incessantly, one entry read. Miss Elms is a sculpture of despair, yet her fingers continuously mime the action of turning a book page. This explained the most chilling detail of the photograph, the perpetual penmanship. The children were not simply posed, their paralyzed bodies were locked mid-action, a final, horrifying flicker of nerve impulse mimicking their last conscious task. They were dead, or very close to it, yet still performing the rote labor of the classroom. Thorne's last anguished entry detailed his confrontation with Mistress Albright. I warned the woman this was not discipline, but death. She merely smiled, stating that the pupils were merely dedicating their full selves to their lessons, having conquered all frivolous distractions. She barred the door against my return, citing my lack of spiritual understanding. The community backed her, terrified of admitting the true horror sweeping their perfectly quiet town. Alastair now had the medical explanation for the absolute stillness, confirming that the photograph documented a macabre, self-perpetuating post-mortem lesson. Alastair's tireless pursuit of original source material led him to a small, secluded farmhouse 20 miles from the ruins of Oakhaven. There, he met Mrs. Eleanor Cole, a descendant of a family who had lived through the Great Quietude. Mrs. Cole possessed a small, leather-bound journal, the diary of her great-great-grandmother, Elara Quinn, whose son, Samuel, was one of the children in the photograph. The diary entries from August 1878 chronicled a mother's agonizing descent into fear. Initially, Elara noted a strange tiredness in Samuel. He barely spoke today, only nodding when I asked if he was hungry. He went to bed with his slate, not his toy soldier. Mistress Albright says he is finally achieving focus. As the quiet ailment progressed, the tone changed dramatically. Elara wrote of her frantic helplessness. Samuel sits at the table, his eyes are wide, but they hold no light. He makes no sound, no fuss. He did not eat the stew, but his hand, his small, precious hand, was moving on the tabletop all night, scratching an invisible alphabet. I cannot rouse him, but Albright insists he is merely immersed in his studies and must not be disturbed. The entry on the day the photograph was taken was the most devastating. Ilara had tried to keep Samuel home, but Mistress Albright arrived at the Quinn doorstep with the schoolmaster in tow, demanding the boys' attendance for the official documentation of their progress. I dressed him this morning, my boy who cannot look at me, my boy who is colder than the winter stone. Albright and the old man carried him the last few yards to the schoolhouse door. They set him at his desk like an idol. Albright looked at me with such pride, saying that Samuel had achieved a divine state of concentration, just in time for the picture. I watched through the window. I saw the flash. And then I saw them leave him there, his hand still moving, etching his final silent lesson into the wood. I know now my child is gone. But Oakhaven insists he is only learning. This diary was the first tangible proof of the community's willful denial, showing the terrible emotional toll of the lie Oakhaven chose to uphold, a lie enforced by the steel will of Mistress Albright. The schoolmaster's fragmented diary, Bartholomew Finch's account, provided the most chilling depiction of the atmosphere inside Cedarwood Schoolhouse leading up to the infamous photograph. By early October 1878, the quiet ailment had claimed nearly every student. The room, which once held the sounds of scraping chalk and youthful shouts, was now enveloped in a suffocating vacuum of silence. Finch's entries described his growing horror at the sight of the children, silent, rigid, their faces slack and pale beneath their concentration. The air was thick and fetid, a terrible miasma of illness and unacknowledged death, but Mistress Albright refused to open the windows or light a proper fire, fearing distractions from the outside world. The children are sculptures now, Finch scrawled in a shaky hand. They sit with their pencils fixed, but there is no life in their stillness, only a ghastly, cold rigor. I heard the scritch-scratch of young Samuel Quinn's pencil for 3 hours without pause, but when I looked, the pencil was stationary, held by a hand that cannot feel, the sound only an echo in my desperate mind. The last bell that summoned the children for recess or sent them home was never rung. Mistress Albright declared the concept of an end to lessons frivolous. She would walk the aisles, tapping her ruler on the silent desks, praising the perfect, unblinking obedience of the pupils whose bodies were already beginning to fail. Finch described his final, pitiful act of resistance, retreating to the back corner of the room, near the map and the old globe, positioning himself as far as possible from the front row of death. This explained his spectral, detached presence in the photograph, a ghost within the frame. When the church elder arrived with the photographer, Mistress Albright merely informed them the children were engaged in a deep, silent examination. She ordered Finch to stay put, his duty now only to stand as a silent witness to her grand achievement. The silence in the room was not discipline, it was the final, total surrender to the grave. Alastair's breakthrough came in the form of a small, leather-bound transaction book found within the Regional Historical Archive. It was the ledger of Mr. Selwyn Vance, a traveling photographer based out of St. Louis, who serviced isolated Midwestern towns. An entry dated October 12, 1878, confirmed the commission, Oakhaven Schoolhouse, requested by Elder Baines. Subject, Classroom Study, for Virtue and Diligence Portfolio. Fee, $8.50. Attached to the entry was a folded piece of paper. Vance's rough, professional notes on the session, intended for billing, but revealing his personal unease. Vance was a technician, interested primarily in lighting and exposure times, yet his notes betrayed an encounter that had clearly shaken him. A most difficult sitting. Light was adequate, but the subjects held too still. Uncannily so. The mistress, Albright, insisted on a very long exposure, near 2 minutes, to capture the permanence of their concentration. But the stillness of the children was beyond the natural pose of any child. It was the immobility of the inanimate. Vance noted the lack of any sound, save for the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the schoolmaster in the background, and the occasional, thin scrape of a pencil that seemed to have no human source. He specifically wrote of the mistress's disturbing involvement. She kept adjusting the small, fair-haired boy in the front row. Twice. His pencil would slip from his frozen grip, and she would gently replace it, positioning his hand to hold the instrument just so. Her movements were careful, almost reverent, as if arranging flowers. Her eyes never left the work. Vance's final, scribbled thought captured the psychological horror of the scene. I felt as if I was not capturing a moment of life, but staging a final tableau, a waxworks display of the recently expired. I rushed the departure. The silence of that room was a heavy, terrible thing. A silence that seemed to have weight and substance, and I could not wait to leave it behind. This account confirmed that Mistress Albright was actively maintaining the illusion, physically manipulating the bodies of the dead children to achieve her perfect photograph. Vance's photograph was not a spontaneous image, it was a carefully composed post-mortem performance. Alastair's search through the state archives for anything related to the Oakhaven fever eventually yielded a crucial document, a rare, unofficial memorandum from the county sheriff's office. This memo detailed the reluctant visit of a deputy, summoned not by Dr. Thorne, but by the distant county seat after Thorne's desperate, ignored letters finally reached higher authority. The visit occurred 4 days after the photograph was taken. The memo, stark and bureaucratic, contained the most chilling fact yet. The deputy, a man named Barnaby, his surname deliberately redacted, described the immediate, overwhelming smell that greeted him upon forcing the locked schoolhouse door open. He found Mistress Albright alone, sitting at her desk, marking slates with a satisfied smile. His report stated, "The children were exactly as depicted in the photographic specimen presented to me. 22 children seated at their desks. Their postures were perfect, their pencils clutched. I performed an immediate, rudimentary physical inspection. Based on the severity of the rigor mortis and the distinct, irreversible discoloration of the skin, particularly around the pale hands fixed to the desks, I estimate that the average time of death for the majority of the pupils was between 70 and 80 hours prior to my arrival. This meant the children in the photograph had been dead for a minimum of 3 full days when Mr. Vance set up his camera. The silence that Vance had described was not merely the stillness of discipline, or even the last breath of the stasis silentia. It was the heavy, final silence of true expiration. Mistress Albright hadn't just allowed the sick children to remain. She had preserved her perfectly obedient corpses for the singular purpose of documentation. The report concluded with Barnaby's interrogation of Albright, who remained totally unrepentant. When questioned about the state of the children, she simply gestured to the slates and stated, "They were nearly finished. A photographer was already paid. I would not allow them to abandon their final lesson." Oakhaven had not just created a cover-up, they had allowed a woman to curate a museum of the dead to preserve a lie of moral fortitude. Alastair's investigation now turned to the man who paid for the tableau of the dead, Elder Horace Baines. Baines was Oakhaven's self-appointed chief moral advocate, a wealthy timber merchant obsessed with the village's reputation. Alastair located a series of frantic, self-aggrandizing letters Baines sent to a powerful regional newspaper editor in Cincinnati. Baines's letters made no mention of sickness or death. They were filled with bombastic claims about Oakhaven being a bastion of moral order, untouched by the frivolous decadence of modern cities. His primary objective was clear: to attract prosperous, God-fearing families to purchase his timberland and settle in the community, boosting his own influence and wealth. In one letter dated just days before the photograph, Baines wrote, "The quietude here is a sign. It is proof that our children, unlike yours, have conquered their base instincts. We have achieved a level of discipline and silence that must be documented for the nation. I have commissioned a photograph of the schoolhouse, a living testament to Oakhaven's unparalleled moral fortitude, to showcase this divine example." Baines saw the children's unnatural stillness not as a symptom of a deadly fever, but as an investment opportunity. He was not mourning, he was marketing. When Dr. Thorne attempted to warn the community and the elder about the mounting deaths, Baines effectively silenced him, using his influence with the town council to declare the doctor unstable and his diagnosis heresy against the town's good name. The photographic commission was a calculated, deliberate act of propaganda. The horror of Mistress Albright's actions, preserving the corpses for 3 days, was entirely facilitated by Elder Baines's eagerness to create a perfect, marketable lie. He needed proof of the silence to secure his fortunes, and the photograph, stripped of its gruesome context, served his purpose perfectly. It was a terrifying realization. The photograph that preserved the children's death was ultimately about profit and reputation, not education or remembrance. Following the coordinates gleaned from the old land deeds, Alastair drove to the site of the Cedarwood Schoolhouse. All that remained was a foundation stone and a patch of overgrown, suspiciously even ground. The building itself had long since been dismantled, its components scattered across the county. Through exhaustive property records, Alastair traced several pieces of the original furniture to a small, private historical society dedicated to early woodworking. There, he finally came face to face with the remnants of the classroom. 3 of the original cedarwood desks from the front row. The desks were dark, heavy, and simple in their construction. But it wasn't the material that captured Alastair's attention, it was the surface. The smooth, aged wood was marred by an almost invisible pattern of minute, shallow scratches. They weren't the deep gouges of a bored child's knife, but delicate, repetitive scorings, like the faint trail left by a pencil tip guided by an unsteady hand. Alastair realized these marks corresponded precisely to the final, terrifying movements described by Dr. Thorne and the mother, Alara Quinn. The residual nerve impulses that forced the dead children's hands to continue the motion of writing. The quiet ailment had ended their lives, but it hadn't fully quelled the mechanical reflex of their last, forced task. He examined the desk nearest the window. The very one occupied by the fair-haired boy Mistress Albright had twice adjusted for the photographer. On the top right corner, right where the child's hand would have rested, was a dense cluster of these faint scores, almost like a repetitive, unreadable signature. The historian was overcome by a profound chill. These were not mere pieces of furniture. They were the final resting places of the children, the physical receptacles of their last, agonizing acts. The chalk dust and sweat of living pupils had long since faded, replaced by the faint, eerie evidence of the mechanical dead. The desks had absorbed the final, silent lesson, becoming relics that whispered the truth louder than any written history. Having confirmed the physical evidence on the desks, Alastair delved into local folklore and later classified police reports from the decades following the closure of the Cedarwood Schoolhouse. He was searching for the chilling rumors that always accompany a deeply buried trauma. He found several. The cedarwood furniture, sold off quickly and cheaply, had dispersed into homes and smaller businesses throughout the county. Alastair found 3 separate reports, spanning from 1885 to 1901, detailing bizarre phenomena linked to the desks. One account, a statement to the local sheriff, came from a small-town accountant who bought 2 of the desks for his office. He reported an inexplicable, faint, scratching sound, emanating from the cedarwood late at night. The sound was not consistent with mice or settling wood, it was rhythmic, quick, and distinct, like a pencil on a slate. He claimed he would sometimes find tiny, almost microscopic grooves etched into the varnish where no such marks had been before. More unsettling was the account of a seamstress who repurposed one desk as a cutting table. She claimed her hands, while working, would occasionally seize up in a spasm of obedience, her fingers unconsciously mimicking the motions of holding a pen and writing, even as she held a pair of shears. She called it the quiet curse, and eventually burned the desk, terrified the dead children's work was possessing her own living hands. These rumors, often dismissed as rural superstition, were chillingly consistent with Dr. Thorne's initial diagnosis of the quiet ailment and the residual nerve impulses. The desks weren't merely haunted, they were active, physical receptacles of the pupil's final, forced labor. The sheer discipline demanded by Mistress Albright had been so absolute that the final, automated flickers of life were literally impressed upon the wood. The children were silent, yet their hands, driven by a post-mortem reflex, continued to practice the eternal lesson she had commanded. Alastair returned to the small farmhouse to speak again with Mrs. Eleanor Cole, the keeper of Alara Quinn's agonizing diary. This time, he didn't ask about the past. He asked about the present and the customs passed down through the Quinn line. He showed her the pages from the old police reports, detailing the quiet curse and the mechanical hand movements linked to the cedarwood furniture. Mrs. Cole, a woman who had previously maintained a veneer of stoic country resilience, visibly trembled as she read the accounts. "We knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the old grandfather clock. We never spoke of the sickness or the photograph, but the truth, it gets into the blood, doesn't it? It becomes a habit of fear. Mrs. Cole revealed a series of seemingly arbitrary family rules that had governed her childhood and that of her parents, rules that made chilling sense now. They had an absolute prohibition against using any writing instruments made of cedar wood. They would never place their elbows directly on any antique wooden table, especially in the home. Most tellingly, they had a peculiar, reflexive aversion to sustained, perfect silence in any room. My mother used to say, "Never let the room get too still, Eleanor," she confided. She'd hum, tap her foot, or insist on leaving the radio on low, even when we slept. She said the silence was the waiting room of the dead. I always thought it was nerves. Now I know she was afraid of giving the dead children's hands a chance to start their work again. She confessed that the family's terror wasn't the loss itself, but the horrifying thought that Samuel, her ancestor, had never truly rested. The belief was that Mistress Albright's fanatical demand for perpetual work had somehow trapped the children, forcing their final, meaningless actions to linger in the wood and the air of Oakhaven, a final, total act of obedience from beyond the grave. Alastair's investigation culminated with the institutional records detailing the fate of Matilda Albright. Following Deputy Barnaby's grim discovery in October 1878, she was immediately arrested. However, the local court system, wary of the explosive scandal that would arise from prosecuting a teacher for arranging dead pupils, quickly deferred the matter. Albright was not charged with a capital crime. Instead, she was committed to the state asylum, categorized not as a murderer, but as an individual suffering from moral delusion and systemic mania. Her asylum records paint a picture of terrifying, quiet contentment. She never expressed remorse or confusion. In her mind, she had achieved the zenith of her life's work. Her institutionalized years were characterized by the obsessive grading of imaginary slates. The nurse's notes consistently described her routine. She would sit for hours at a small, plain table, her back perfectly straight, her hands moving over the surface as if holding chalk. She spoke only to announce her grades, perfect concentration, a plus, or absolute stillness, flawless effort. She never spoke the children's names, referring to them only as the pupils, or the silent scholars. Her final recorded act, just before her death in 1893, was to declare the completion of her final examination. A nurse found her body posed upright in her chair, her eyes open and fixed on the blank wall, a serene, chilling smile on her lips. A final notation in her file, written by the attending physician, summarized her case. She never regretted the deception or the loss of life. She merely believed she had forced the purest form of obedience upon a chaotic world. Her students, in their stillness, had provided her with the only form of respect she ever truly desired. The authorities' decision to institutionalize her was a final act of Oakhaven's complicity. By classifying her as mad, they avoided the necessity of public burials, judicial proceedings, and the national scrutiny that would have exposed the extent of the village's eagerness to bury the truth about the Great Quietude. Alastair knew that the final, most solemn piece of the puzzle lay in the ground. The official Oakhaven death register for 1878 listed only a handful of elderly citizens, a clear indicator of the extent of the lie. The 22 children of the Cedarwood Schoolhouse had been erased from the civic memory. Following an obscure footnote in Deputy Barnaby's supplemental report, Alastair drove to the edge of Oakhaven's oldest cemetery. Tucked away from the stately granite monuments of the town founders and Elder Baines's own impressive plot, lay an overgrown section bordering the forgotten cedar woods. This was the burial ground for the unclaimed and the unwanted. Here, Alastair found them, a low, long row of simple slate markers, uniform in size and material, clustered together in chilling proximity. They bore no names, only dates. The dates were all tightly grouped around October 1878, the time immediately following the deputy's forced entry. The markers did not proclaim the innocence of childhood or the tragedy of a life cut short. They were mute and identical, offering only the barest acknowledgement of existence. They were the final, physical manifestation of Oakhaven's collective desire to silence the event completely. By denying the children their names and individual plots among the respected citizens, The town leaders ensured the quiet ailment would be remembered as a non-event, a collective fever dream that had quickly passed. Alastair knelt beside the row of slates, which felt unnervingly similar to the teaching tools the children had last held. He realized the bodies had been removed from the schoolhouse and interred with the same cold, efficient disregard with which they had been left at their desks. The children's graves were not a memorial, they were a storage solution. They were the ultimate proof that the town valued its reputation for fortitude more than the lives of its young. The silence of the classroom had become the silence of the earth. Alastair Finch completed his research, the full, harrowing history of the Cedarwood schoolhouse assembled from forgotten diaries, frantic medical ledgers, and whispered rumor. He presented his findings to the academic community, publishing an extensive article titled, The Post-Mortem Classroom, Discipline and Deception in Oakhaven, 1878. The final act, however, belonged to the photograph itself. Alastair had the image, the silence of the Cedarwood schoolhouse, professionally restored, revealing new, minute details previously obscured by time and grime. The crisp image of Mistress Albright now seemed even colder, her rigid posture less an educator's stance and more a triumphant sentry guarding her perfectly silenced domain. The old schoolmaster in the background appeared more spectral than ever, a man utterly defeated by the horror he was forced to witness. But it was the children, the silent scholars, who held the ultimate truth. When magnified, the faint chalk residue on the fingertips of several pupils became starkly visible, evidence of their 3 days of post-mortem toil. The light pouring from the large windows, which had seemed so bright and full of life, now appeared to illuminate a dark, sealed tomb. The very grain of the cedarwood desks seemed to hold the coldness of the fever and the terror of the lingering nerve impulses. The photograph, once a piece of forgotten curiosity, was now fully revealed as a historical document of human failing, a testament to one woman's fanaticism, one community's cowardice, and the terrible price of maintaining a perfect, marketable lie. It was not a picture of stillness, it was the photographic record of the moment stillness became death. Alastair often reflected on the image, particularly the expressionless faces bent over their slates. He realized the echo wasn't in the rumors of scratching furniture, it was in the total absence of life captured forever on the plate. The children of Cedarwood Schoolhouse had been silenced by fever, abused by a madwoman, and erased by their town, but through this single chilling image, their true, final, and terrifying lesson was finally delivered. The price of perfect silence was everything.